Hey guys, my name is Mike. I work at Meeshkan, which is a very small consulting company, of which 3 of the 4 employees are currently here. Actually, most of our clients are other consulting companies or agencies that build apps using APIs. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you guys have worked in the past 12 months on a project that uses a REST API? Okay. That's 100%. So good. Hopefully this talk will give you some ideas for your practice. It's in JavaScript. We're launching a Python library to do a similar thing, or rather we have launched it but need to improve. And we're also developing a PHP one pretty soon. And then we're interested in other platforms as well. And the last brief kind of salesy pitch that I'll make before we get into the actual stuff is if any of this stuff like is more of interest, like don't hesitate to reach out because we have a professional service that does this and more. So without further ado, I would like to present. What we're going to do is, how many of you guys have used this method called koans before when you wanted to learn a new language? One, Carolyn from our company, because she didn't have the choice because she did these. So the way it works is that it's a series of things that fail, and you have to make them succeed, which is way nicer than life, which is a series of things you want to succeed but ultimately fail. So it's like a win-win situation for everybody. So there's 9 tests, and I've rigged it up so that you can do yarn test 1, and not surprisingly, it will run the first test. Because I'm using Windows, Jest is a bit slow, and it'll fail. So all we're going to do over the next 27 minutes is make a bunch of tests pass. And I'd like it to be pretty collaborative. And then hopefully by then I'll have presented the idea that I would like to present to all of you today. So this is done in TypeScript. And the first little bit, we have interface for a user, which is really simple. An ID, a number, no name, because in the future we'll only be referred to by our ID, and is admin, which is either true if the person is an administrator of our fictional service, or false. So we're going to write a test. This uses a platform or a testing suite called Jest, but I mean, of course, you can use Tape or Mocha or Chai or whatever you want. And the test has a nice message. Users are split into admins and not admins. So what we're doing is we're testing a function called split users that is supposed to split it into 2 groups, admin and not admin. So we already ran the test. So we had an expectation that the admins would be the person where admin is true, and an expectation that not admins would have admin being false. So the admin expectation worked, whereas the not admin didn't. So something about the function messed up on the not admins, and more precisely, it put an admin, true, into the not admin pile. So we're going to have to fix the function knowing that that's the mistake it did. So now we're going to go to the function itself, split users, that splits users into admins and not admins. And there's some mistake in how not admins is constructed that is putting the admins in there. So with your JavaScripting skills, can you guys see what about the filter function is off?
There's an exclamation mark missing on line 14.
Yes. So let's just put one there and then everything. No, I'm just kidding. We'll put it...
Try some other places.
That's how I
get it right.
That's how I roll. I just put them everywhere until it works. So
I mean, the test is going to tell you, right?
Yeah, true. That's test-driven development. So it's a great way to learn JavaScript. So great, it passes. Excellent. So we made it pass our split users function. So we passed the first test. So we only have 8 more to go until I'm hired by Futurice, which is the real reason. So we now are going to take the same exact test that we had before, right? The same split users function, and miraculously your solution has been propagated into the second test, so we already have the bang there. But what's different is that split users doesn't take a list of users anymore. Instead, it's a function inside of it that makes an API call, because it's quite rare that people store the list of users on the hard drive of the server and then just fetch a static asset periodically, although I guess that exists too. But this is going to fetch a list of users, so we see await using this library called Axios, fetching some users. So what I'd like to talk about today, I forget the title of the talk, but it's something like how to make dealing with your client's broken API less soul-crushingly awful. I think that was the title. And the idea is exactly that how to not some elaborate system, not some giant like Swagger file where you have to go in and champion that like everything works, but what's the dirty hack you can do in 2 minutes just to make it slightly easier to work with an API that's kind of broken. So what we've developed in the open source wing of Meeshkan, which is also the commercial wing of Meeshkan because we're 4 people, is this tool called Unmock. So how many of you guys from JavaScript land have used knock? Okay, so 3, I see. So the reason we made the syntax this way is that so that if you're already using knock, you could just put unmock dot before it, and you've migrated to unmock. So we're greedy like that it just makes like the transition a little bit easier. So what you do, currently this is, for those of you who recognize knock syntax, this is exactly like knock. So there's going to be nothing, there's no justifiable reason to use our thing compared to knock, but what it will do is say, hey, when I call this URL, at this path, reply with 200, so yay, happy, everything works, with this list of admins, right? And then down in here, we're going to filter the same exact thing. So this is a pretty awful test, in my opinion, because it hard-codes data, because it expects that the data down here is going to correspond to the stuff that we hard-coded up there. But for all intents, and let's just say that, like, okay, we accept that that exists, so we run the test, and it will fail again. And it fails because it's going to call myservice.io, and we see that we got a not found, meaning it actually tried to call the real API. So the deal with Unmock is that you have to turn it on because it's kind of rude to do a man-in-the-middle attack unless you ask people if you can. So we haven't turned Unmock on. Using your powers of deduction, if this is the API to turn Unmock off after the tests, what would you think would be the thing turns it on before? He doesn't know the answer, so he's trying to...
Unmock on.
Great. So let's run it again. And it does exactly that. So test passed, we've turned Unmock on, and now whenever we call myservice.io, it will respond with this, and if we call anything else, it will just say, hey, we don't have a mock for that. So when you turn it on, it eats the entire file unless you turn it off within an individual test, which is fine as well. So now I'm going to get to like the main reason Unmock exists, and to be frank, the main reason that the company exists, and the big difference with Knock. APIs rarely return static data. It's quite uncommon that you call an API like that will always return the same result. I can't even really think of an instance where that would happen. Otherwise, you wouldn't call an API. So API output is dynamic, and your test should kind of reflect that. So I'm going to show 2 things in the next test. One is that we've rewritten the test so that instead of expecting like some hard-coded response, we're going to expect that in the admins there's admins, and in the not admins there's not admins. So that's kind of a more honest way to describe how we think the API is going to work. Great, but we still have the hard-coded data. Or do we? So now, split users hasn't changed, but I'm going to scroll up to Unmock, and instead of returning a hard-coded array, I have this weird U syntax. So I import U from Unmock, and U, why is it called U? It's because U is short to type. That's the only reason. U.array will generate an arbitrary array between 0 and many, many, many users, right? So now we're no longer hard-coding the array that we're going to serve back from the API, but we have a dynamically generated array, U.array, that will be served. So I'm going to run the test here. In that array, there will be an object, curly braces, with a dynamically created number. But remember, the whole thing is about figuring out who is and isn't an admin. And we were expecting on line something, the admin to be false, and instead we got undefined. Why? Because we didn't define an admin in our object. So looking at the way that we identify ID and remembering how admin is defined, can anybody guess what the Unmock syntax would be to define is admin? Yeah.
Maybe is admin and then u.boolean?
The autocomplete, I don't know why it did that.
Yeah, just press tab a couple of times and it will go okay.
Yeah. Yeah, when I code, I just use the tab key. Yeah, great. So it did that. So Unmock has a rich suite of tools that mirrors something called Json Schema. which is also used in OpenAPI, or there's kind of, it's not a direct subset, unfortunately. So this combines the best of both worlds and use both. So you can create an array, you can create a list, you can create an optional parameter. So if we didn't know if isAdmin was already going to exist, we could put u.opt isAdmin, although I didn't update Unmock, so it's getting the red line, but that exists in the API now. If we wanted a tuple instead, we could do u.tuple, and that would always return one thing instead of an array of variable length. We could also control things like, for example, let's say that it's an integer. We could say like minimum 0 if only positive integers are IDs. So you can control a little bit how the random data is generated just with this syntax. You actually have much more control, as we'll see a little bit later on. But here, this is a good start to show dynamic data generation. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember that when you're testing an entity like an API that has dynamic behavior, you should always test with a tool that works dynamically, except, I mean, there's exceptions to that. But yeah, this way, it doesn't hard code any logic that, like, let's say that you leave the company, God forbid, knock on wood, and somebody else comes in, it's much clearer that the schema of the expectation of how the array works. So, before I show this next test, what would be maybe the problem with testing randomly generated data only once?
So what do you have, if you have isAdmin true for all of the entities?
Yeah, that's the problem. So you never test the false case, right? So we are going to do the same thing here, except I've taken out admin, and I'm going to put age. But I've swung it so that instead of being true false, it's either it's a number or null. So it's kind of conceptually similar. It's just it'll be one of two things. The age will be either a number or null. So you use u.anyOf. Age will be an integer greater than 0 or null, right? So let's say that your code has a bug when age is null. If you only generate it once, it's not going to provoke that bug. It's exactly what you said. So I'll run the test, and already now you guys know it'll fail. Unmock has a concept of a runner. So you just import runner, which you see up here. And then down in your test, you wrap the test. So you have the name of the test, and then you just wrap it in runner. And runner is a stupid, simple construct that just runs the thing 20 times. You can control how many times it's run, but it does it 20 times. And we've optimized it, not unlike fast check. If you've used that library, or for you Haskellers, there's quick check. There's like something check kind of in every language these days. And this uses a similar type of algorithm to make sure that it goes really fast. And we also made it work right out of the box with Jest, and we're working on Mocha support right now. So it runs it 20 times, and it fails. So I made the age null, potentially. It fails because our junior admins that we could see there, we have an expectation that their age is less than 65, and we got the value null. Maybe, had we run the test only once, we wouldn't have gotten that value null. So, great. We found a bug in our code. Let's fix it. So now, let's look at how we're creating junior admins, which is on this line. It's weird, because we have this test, user.age is less than 65, so why would null pass that test in JavaScript land? For those of you who are, it's kind of a JS Ninja question, I'll show in a second, but how does null behave in JavaScript? What do you say? Badly, yeah. It does. Null behaves like this. Yeah. So it behaves badly. Meaning it should, like, maybe in an ideal world that would throw an exception saying, what are you doing? But actually it's just like, okay, I am less than 65. I wonder actually, whereas undefined is not less than 65. Like, who knew? So yeah, that's, welcome to JavaScript. So that's not good because we have null in there. So can somebody suggest something that would get rid of null in our junior admins age field?
So wrapping the user.age. Make sure that that exists and it's smaller than 65.
Yeah, I'm gonna, the only danger with that, you're right, is that this would fail for 0. So if you had a baby admin, it wouldn't go through. But like, maybe you don't want a baby admin, to be fair. But we could, I'll just to be pedantic, I'll put that. But yeah, I probably wouldn't actually want any baby admins anyway. So, but we'll do this. We'll do it up here too for our senior admins. And now, when I run the test, it gets rid of our bugs. So like the slight ego hit of finding bugs by using the runner is way better than the massive ego hit of this going into production. So like please use the runner when you're using something like this. So that's the end of chapter 1. Now I'm going to talk on something that my home country does really well, America, which is spying. So this is about spying on API requests and responses. So far I've only talked about the output of a function that may or may not call an API. A lot of times you don't care about the output. For example, if you're working with an API that doesn't return any body when you have a delete statement, then there's really nothing to do with the output. You just need the delete to kind of happen. So what we do in Unmock is we have it such that if you give a name to your service, here I call it my service because I'm not that original, then that service exists on an unmock services object, which we do by total hackish monkey patching, which is like our favorite like development method, but it exists. So now if you call that, you get access to work programmatically with a service you've defined called my service. So what that access gives you, amongst other things, is that you can call myService.spy. And you could spy on what happened under the hood. So if we run this, again, not surprisingly, it'll fail, but we should be able to fix it. We are spying on it, and we're saying we're expecting that our post request called users/42. Well, we're calling users/ID. We're passing in 42. So what's the problem? It's failing. It says that we expected a matching call for our post request, and we got 0. Why? Looking at this line here. Yeah, exactly. Or maybe if you want to throw it to...
It's a delete request.
Exactly. So, like, assuming that we're not sadistic API designers, what would you change this to in order to mirror that? Great. No, you're wrong. It's foobar. So, you call... yeah, delete request path. And it'll have that expectation. Now, you could, if you're using knock, like hack something like this, and that's totally cool, but it exists in Unmock right out of the box. So there you go, it passes. Another type of spying that I like, which is like kind of the opposite, is you spy on the get request, or the response body. So I think this is really important because, I know that no junior developers work at Futurice, but imagine one day you hire one, then that person is going to... when they're looking at a test, they're going to want to understand how your code interacts with the API, and putting that we expect something to match an object, that was their get request body, is a lot clearer when you're reading the code than to expect it to equal like a random object. So we're going to run this test again, or not again for the first time, and we'll see it fails in a way that like my production code has failed before. So here, we were expecting an array or an object with users, and we got an object of users. How many of you guys have done something kind of like that before? Oh yeah, that's like almost 100%. So yeah, it happens. But again, because you're checking against the spy, it helps you validate the way that the API is aggregated and treated, which is what you really want to do, test your business logic as opposed to like reverse engineering your clients. So here, if we look at the function, we want to fix it. We've defined in Unmock that we're serving back an array called users. So when we get the data, we stuff the data in an object that has users data. So what would be the way now to get rid of my users so that I just have users?
Spread the data.
Yep. That'll do it. You could also do data.users. There's like several ways to do it, but spreading works. So there you go. So by spying on requests and responses, we could have really expressive tests that are not too bad to read. So the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about is initializing mocks. So I said the most important thing you should remember from this talk, aside from hiring Meeshkan because we're so awesome, is that you should never hard code a response, and that doesn't just have to do with the response, but it also has to do with the reply codes, because again, you never work with an API that doesn't fail from time to time. So here we've put that a possible reply is 200.41404. So it is, of course, possible to make a separate test file for everything, but we like the idea that the entire spec lives in one place, and at least some tests in your code base are smoke tests that just test kind of what happens when it succeeds or fails. So I'll run test 7, just so that I could have the output, but let me walk you through the file. So our split users function that we've had, that we've now corrected many times, the only difference between this and everything else is that now it has a try-catch block. I've added that. So now that we have 401 and 404, that's entirely possible. We have the runner, so what the runner means is like, hey, sometimes it's going to be 200, sometimes 401, etc. Down here, we see that 1 passed and 1 failed. So the test that passed is our first test, saying that if there's an error, we expect the length of both arrays to be 0, which here in the catch block, if there's an error, it returns arrays with 0 length. So that test is a good spec. However, here, 200 will never yield an error. So if you remember that we were using myService.spy, myService has one other member called .state. And .state is how you initialize mocks to kind of set up the world if you want to test a specific case. So here we're saying 200 will never yield an error, but what's actually happening in the test is we're using this function called without codes, which we import here from Unmock, so transform without codes. It uses, have any of you guys used FPTS at all? It's a TypeScript library. Okay, cool. It uses FPTS and monocle TS under the hood. These are lenses, so they're optics, so they're like series of functions. So without codes 401, but we're still getting an error, meaning that in the test we can see that error is true. So if we got rid of 401, why are we still getting an error given that this is the spec?
So it can still return 404.
Yeah.
Apparently.
So.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that was the 404. So, so there's 2 ways to fix it. Down here, you have to kind of guess based on what you know about the syntax. But what might be one way to fix this?
Maybe just add more codes there as extra parameters or as a list or something like that.
Yeah. No, I did not want to open up news on my Windows machine. Sorry. Yeah, so that's one way to do it, is add extra ones. And it'll work. My vote, because it's a test that's talking about 200 happening, it's probably better to do the positive case so that it corresponds to the test. So what would you guess the function would be called that does that?
How about with codes?
Yes. It's coding consa is actually the name. With codes. I would love to make an API only in Finnish. I think that would be such a fun exercise for an open source project. And now I need to make it 200. Yeah, and it'll work. So that's you're absolutely right. That's another way to do it. You could also set the response body. So this gets a little bit to what I was talking about with functional programming, but we use optics. So you could say that if you're returning users, which is what's happening here, so we're returning an array of users called users. We want to use with codes 200 and then zoom into the response body, set the users to be an empty array. So already, if you're into functional programming, what's happening here, that's just a pipe operation. And what's really happening under the hood is that it takes the spec that we defined above, pipes it through with codes, and pipes it through a response body. And we could even see that because these are actually just functions. So to show you what's happening, it's a request and our spec to with codes that calls our request and our spec. So now it's just a no op. But that's what's happening under the hood, and that's why it's a pipe option. Man, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do the thing that nobody should ever do, but I'll just solve this one myself because it's kind of long and usually I have more time. That elect admin elects an administrator, so it's going to take the first admin from our list. You guys can just tell me, why might not this return an admin? Empty list, yeah. So we could change the test to be, will always be able to elect an admin when an admin exists, and now we've set it as an empty list, but now we're going to do ID 0 is admin. True. No, not is a min, is admin true, and then the test will pass. So yeah, that we can make that the case instead. I actually think that's a pretty bad test. I wouldn't write, like, that test doesn't, I mean, it's okay, but it's like, If you add too many tests like this and you're only testing corner cases, then you'll have like 5,000 unit tests, and then at that point, that's just as no, it's not just as bad as having none at all, but like it kind of sucks. So I would recommend not writing tests like this, but it's for demonstration purposes. And the last thing to show is that because it's functional programming, we have a really fun, slick API where you pass functions to functions. So with codes can go to the times function, which says how many times something happens. So here happens once, that there is 200, except we are expecting that the error will be false twice. So it may work, it may not. It depends if it chooses 200, but it looks like it didn't. It looks like on the second time it chose error to be true. So what will we change times to make this test pass? It's a little artificial, but I heard it, but not with a microphone. How many times does it need to happen so that error is true twice?
2?
Yes. Cool. So that's a whirlwind tour of, yeah, good job. Yeah, I know that it's kind of anticlimactic to get to that and be like, yeah, it has to be 2, but it is, so well done. So now we can bask in the glory of having a bunch of tests that pass by running the whole shebang. So what I've done here is demonstrated a new open source testing library that my company Meeshkan is developing called Unmock. It will help you in a pinch. You don't have to define a whole API spec, just like in one file, one spec to get the ball over the net, especially if there's a lot of variable input. If that is too hard, given your client case, then we are around to help out if anybody needs that. But at the very least, we would love to have more people try this out. We only, not that GitHub stars actually matter, but I'll just say that we only have 24 and Knock has 5,782. So we really hope that we'll catch up a little bit, not necessarily in terms of stars, but in terms of community love. Which at least if my startup doesn't succeed with money, we will succeed with community love. So although you're live streaming this, crap, maybe the investors are watching. Sorry, I didn't say that. Redact that part. Okay, great. So thank you very much for checking this out. We're Meeshkan. At least the whole company is in the audience. Meeshkan, do you want to wave? Yeah, sorry, one of them was drinking beer. So that's how we roll. But that's how you roll too, so there you go. So thanks a lot, and I'm excited for the next talk. Thank you.